we always say what happens on campus doesn't stay on campus. And, a lot of what we're seeing in these private corporations and other sectors of our society are a result of some of the really anti-freedom messages that students are learning on college campuses. So, we're in this fight for the long haul, and there's a lot of work to be done.
Welcome back to the Kevin Roberts Show. You are in for a treat today because we have a great American patriot, someone who is often in the news, but also someone who often does his best work somewhat behind the scenes. Jeremy Tedesco, who is the senior counsel, senior vice president of Alliance Defending Freedom. Of all of those organizations the Heritage Foundation works closely with, we are proud to say that ADF is one of our closest friends. Jeremy, thanks for being with me.
Thank you.
So how in the world did you get to do what you're doing now for ADF and for the country?
Well, really, it's just a story of God's goodness and providence in my life. So when I went to law school, I remember going to law school, and as I was getting close to graduating, I told my wife, I'm not going to work in any place except for a place like Alliance Defending Freedom or American Center for Law and Justice, because I really just feel God's call in my life to do work on religious freedom and free speech issues in life. These core issues that animate me and my faith, so important to me individually and from a faith perspective. So, that's a hard nut to crack coming out of law school, but God was good enough to open a door for me at Alliance Defending Freedom. So really out of law school, I immediately started work as a line litigator at ADF and was just handling every case that came through the door that was in our subject area and cut my teeth litigating. So it's been great. I've been there for 18 years. Have loved every minute of it. And the best part of the work we do, which I didn't know going into it, I thought it was all about mission and vision and protecting freedom. It's our clients. Our clients are the true heroes of the work we do. And when you get to know them and you get to understand the sacrifices that they have made to stand in the gap for the freedoms that we all get to experience and enjoy every day, that's just an amazing inspiration. Really
well, I've been a fan of Alliance Defending Freedom for about as long as you've been there, although we've gotten to know each other somewhat well just in the last year or so. But when I was president of Wyoming Catholic College, we took on the government twice, once over the contraceptive mandate on Obamacare. And then where I got to know ADF and some of your colleagues was, as a result of that and rejecting federal student loans and grants, the college became a target by leftists who were on city councils and county commissions. And what they were trying to do was pass these sexual orientation and gender identity laws. This seems like last century, right? I mean, that we'll talk about how that agenda has evolved, but they were trying to basically disallow the college because of its faithfulness and its conservatism from raising money in the jurisdictions of those places. And we were able to ward that off in large part because of help from y'all. All of that to say that you have all kinds of clients at Alliance Defending Freedom. And what I meant earlier in my introduction about doing work behind the scenes is that neither you nor any of your colleagues look for any self-promotion. You're happy to get a pat on the back when y'all win. But I just want to say on behalf of people who have benefited from your work, thank you.
I appreciate that. And what we find, interestingly enough, is a lot of people know our cases. They really know our cases well. I go to a local farm market where I live out in the middle of nowhere, and struck up a conversation with the owner of that farm market a few years ago, and she knew everything about Jack Phillips' Masterpiece Cake Shop. Very passionate about that case. Told her, well, I'm with Alliance Defending Freedom and we represent him, and argued his case at the Supreme Court. She's like, I've never heard of you guys. And so it happens a lot. But behind the scenes. But we want to make it possible for other people to exercise their fundamental freedoms. And it takes people like Jack Phillips and Barronelle Stutzman and so many of our other clients to say, okay, I'm willing to take a stand and suffer real consequences, real costs to defend those freedoms. And we're just, in a position to be able to come alongside them and do the work we do in the courts to defend those freedoms. And it's a true blessing. Yeah.
So about the Jack Phillips case, the Masterpiece case, you were on that team.
That's right.
Tell me about the highest high point and the lowest low point of that experience.
Yeah. So the highest, it's really hard to pick the highest. I'll say two because I have to say this one. One is Jack Phillips, the man. So the first time I showed up at his shop, it's in a strip mall out in a kind of rundown part of Lakewood, Colorado. And I rolled into his parking lot and I jumped out of my car and he jumped out of his, and it was this really rundown minivan. So I jumped out and still chit chat. It's the first time I really met him, and said, "Hey, I have a minivan. I've got 4 kids at the time. I have 5 now." And he said, "Yeah, well, this is my older one. I actually gave my newer one, which is 10 years old. This one was probably 20, to a friend who needed it because they were down a car." And I said something like, "Well, why didn't you give him this one?" And he's like, "Well, because God convicted me one day that when I was about to give this car to someone, my rundown car that breaks down a lot, that I should give him my best, And so I actually was on the way with this clunker and turned around, grabbed my better one, gassed it up and gave it to him. And he said, since then, and anybody knows I'm going to give them my best car if they're down a car. And so I get asked a lot and I always give it to him. And I just thought to myself, this is a really good guy. And the reality is he's like that across all aspects of his life, the way he runs his business, the way he treats people. I mean, he was a true honor to represent. So that's one of the high points, was getting to know Jack Phillips and seeing that the man who was the face of that case was truly good to his core. It wasn't just some kind of persona. And then, of course, it was winning the case 7-2 at the Supreme Court. That was a huge high point. And what a great blessing and a great victory. The court ultimately didn't answer, the free speech, coerced speech question in that case. They decided on religious freedom cases, but it was a great religious freedom win and said that the government can't be hostile to people of faith. And that's a baseline rule of living in a free society. As far as a low point goes, I don't know. What was the low point? I suppose it was just, watching Jack go through everything he went through. Yeah. And
I imagine you were going to say that.
Yeah. Because he lost so many of his employees. He lost so much of his business. His family suffered. But in all that, God worked a lot of good ultimately. And not just winning the case, but in Jack's life too. He had, people come to faith and family members be reconciled. And so there was a lot of good that came from a lot of the costs that we kind of count as costs as in our human perspective. Yeah.
Well, thanks for that summary. I'm curious, as I sit here listening to you recount how great a man Jack Phillips is, and therefore how great most Americans are, right? That there might have been something in your childhood or young adulthood that was this formative episode that convicted you to do the work that you do, but also probably being roughly the same age and having a very similar worldview. It may have also just been the recognition that you had of the evolution of the attacks on religious liberty. But I know that our audience will be curious to know what it was. Was it a single event, or was it Jeremy Tedesco going through life realizing, oh my gosh, religious liberty of all things is under assault?
That's a great question. So there's 2 things that really formed me. One was, and at least in driving me to this work. One was I was very pro-life in high school. And once I started expressing those views in high school, I started losing friends. And I was just very, very, that was an impactful thing for me. I didn't realize that this issue would be so, would cut, such fine lines between myself and my friends. And it was just kind of a wake up call. But it wasn't until I got to college where I got embroiled in a just massive college brouhaha over a lot of the things that we advocate over today: sexual orientation, non-discrimination laws, and how they impact religious freedom. And so I was on one side of the issue, and almost the entire campus was on the other side, promoting, an agenda that I was opposed to. And God just put me in a position where, and he really gave me the courage, it wasn't my own, to kind of stand against this wave. I had professors writing opinion pieces in the campus paper, calling me out, saying that I was a cause for violence on campus against, marginalized people. And I was called into the president's office and reprimanded. And it was a very stressful time in my life, but it also really hardened, my backbone, I think, and gave me courage, to stand up for these things. So it's one of those things you can often in life, you're going along and you're trying to be faithful. But if you take a moment and look back, you can kind of draw a straight line between the experiences that you've had and where you are today, and how God used those things to prepare you for the moments you're in. And I'm humbled by the fact that I get to participate at the levels that I do in protecting freedom, and advocating for these cherished liberties. It's really just an awesome thing I get to do.
And you're so cheerful about it, in spite of all the barbs that come your way. It means you're over the target, right? But
right.
I'm hung up on something, and that is you were called into the president's office. What was that like?
Oh, it was pretty intense. In fact, during that meeting, they basically said, if you keep down this path, we're going to have to call in the lawyers, because you're basically claiming that you've been defamed in the school paper and all these different things. And I had no idea what was going on. I was a college student that was under an intense amount of pressure from the university. But in the end, we kind of all shook hands and left. And the great thing about the whole experience I had in college was all the things that they were trying to shut down, all the events I was trying to hold to put a different perspective out there in the campus community, they all occurred despite and I'm talking about an intense amount of effort to shut them down.
Yeah.
And so we had one of the biggest and most successful events on campus that particular year. And the whole experience was really a success despite all the efforts to shut it down and make it difficult.
No, and out of those moments, those crucibles, if you will, emerge people like you and your colleagues, and so many people in America, not just people like you and me who get to work in public policy or litigation in your case, but most importantly, the Jack Phillips, right? The individual Americans who are just going about their business, raising their families, running their businesses, and this radical agenda, wokeism as we like to call it now, flies in the face of their freedoms. And thank goodness ADF is there to stand up for them. And so from that moment, you're in the president's office trying to figure out what the heck you're going to do. Perhaps you get a little convicted to go to law school. But fast forward to 2022, you and I sit here, we think about the colleagues we get to work with in our respective organizations. And really, if you think about it, almost everything we're dealing with, regardless of the public policy issue, from education to conversations about taxation, even to foreign policy, thinking about what the State and Defense Department spend money on with our personnel overseas, has to do with being woke. What is ADF doing to confront that challenge?
Well, it's really become to define a lot of our work in the sense that the woke agenda, as people like to describe it now, is really pervasive. It's taken over all institutions, or most of them, or is in the process of taking some of the last standing institutions. And so it's really across all the sectors that we work. So whether it's public schools, public universities, workplace issues, we definitely see an incredible amount of overreach by officials in those arenas. And so, we're pushing back hard through litigation and legislation. We're also, and we're going to talk about it, but we're pushing back in the corporate space as well. Yeah. And just from a litigation standpoint, we have really taken head on the threat to parental rights in public schools, especially related to critical race theory being pushed on students, and really in ways that don't just send a really terrible message and toxic message about race and identity, but also in most of these instances, or many of them, forces students to violate their own religious convictions, to affirm values and belief systems that they disagree with. And these are all things that are clearly prohibited by the First Amendment. So it's not just parental rights, it's the students' rights to be free from that kind of compulsion at school. And so, that's an enormous part of the work we do. On college campuses, my view is we've been trying to push back on cancel culture for, literally decades. That's where it all started,
That's right?
And so it's spread. The college graduates that learned the cancel culture ways, the safe space ways, and all those things now are in the corporations. They're in our institutions, and they're taking, unfortunately, the lessons they learned there and applying them in those settings. We always say what happens on campus doesn't stay on campus, and a lot of what we're seeing in these private corporations and other sectors of our society are a result of some of the really anti-freedom messages that students are learning on college campuses. So, we're in this fight for the long haul, and there's a lot of work to be done. I guess one other thing I would say is one of the vanguards of cancel culture, one of the vanguards of wokeism in our culture, the Southern Poverty Law Center, has also made it very personal to us at Alliance Defending Freedom because they put us on their hate group list.
Right.
And, and that's simply because we believe things about marriage and human sexuality and life that they disagree with.
Right. And therefore you're a domestic terrorist.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it really is that simple.
It is. And they just use that list to smear their political opponents and try to silence them. But that has made it personal to us too. And it's personal in very concrete ways. We get denied access to funding programs and other things because that as discredited and obviously politicized as the hate group label is, there are an incredible amount of institutions, media outlets, and others that blindly rely on it for things. Yeah. And we have to work hard to continue to keep our views, our values, our liberties from being labeled hate, and for us being marginalized, ostracized because we stand for these things.
Yeah, I mean, wouldn't America be a better place if the Southern Poverty Law Center would go back to its roots, which I happen to disagree with. Certainly, they have a right to exist, but just go back to being an annoyance for those of us who are conservatives, rather than what is truly ill-intentioned. And I'm someone, as I know you are, who doesn't go through life imputing motive. But in this case, there are now so many years, now well over a decade since they've made this leftward shift, where if someone who calls himself or herself a conservative is not listed as one of their folks on their hate group list, they probably aren't working hard enough. I mean, that's how absurd this list has become, right? It's
so true. And, they have their hate group list, but the thing that people don't know as much about is the Hate Watch blog, which everybody gets an honorable, anybody in the conservative and religious movement who's doing anything of significance, it has been mentioned on there many times. And it's really the stepping stone to ultimately being on the hate group list. So if you're on there enough or something, I don't know, they have their standards are completely vague and subjective, but at some point, they're going to pivot you to the hate group list if you're on there enough.
Yeah. Well, you've decided at ADF to confront in particular the woke agenda in corporations with the Viewpoint Diversity Score Business Index. We'll talk about a prize that Heritage gave you and ADF recently, but tell us about the origins of that, in particular, what it does, because this is a tool that can help people, just average Americans, fight this. But I think that's also something that people have been asking me, as they ask all of you, can you and your organizations give us something to fight back?
Right. So the Business Index is the first comprehensive benchmark to help corporations measure and then improve the respect for viewpoint and religious diversity across their enterprise. We studied their practices and policies in three sectors. We divided them into market, workplace, and public square. And we had 42 questions that we kind of analyzed data and gave them scores on the basis of that data. The index is definitely a tool that's directed at corporations and business leaders to try to help them understand how do you measure viewpoint diversity and religious diversity in the workplace, and then how do you improve your reputation and your atmosphere, your culture within your business corporation when it comes to those issues. But it's also a tool for the broader conservative community and just people who love freedom to look at this and understand how are these corporations failing in this regard. But more importantly, what can we do to try to put pressure on them to make changes, positive changes? To go back to why we did the index. In the end, it's about concentrated power. And the problem of concentrated power in our age really lies with private corporations and private corporate power. And you can see that no greater than with social media companies. It's a very small group of companies control access to and what you can see, say, talk about on these social media platforms. And most Americans, for good or for ill, they kind of conceive of themselves and really do exercise their First Amendment free speech rights in those contexts. Now, the First Amendment doesn't apply to those private corporations. They're private businesses. And so you can't file a First Amendment lawsuit when they censor you or things like that. But the reality is these corporations' policies and practices have an enormous impact on public dialogue and our ability to debate issues,
Right.
which is essential to a free society and democracy thriving and flourishing.
Mm-hmm.
So that plus the fact that we were very concerned about the broader spread of this kind of social media attitude amongst other corporations, financial service providers, banks, kind of led us to believe that there's an enormous risk of private corporations becoming as or greater threat to free speech and religious freedom than the government is.
Yeah.
And so without the, same tools in the toolkit, the First Amendment, being able to file litigation so readily, and even some of the legislative fixes we may have available to us when the government's involved in this kind of conduct. Without those things being available, what do we do about it? And how do we set some kind of a benchmark for what we expect from corporations on this issue? So that's really what birthed the index for us. And so it's a long-term play to try to convince the business community that they really should care about whether they respect the diverse views reflected within their customer base, their workforce, the broader public square. And they should also at least have a net neutral impact on free speech and religious freedom.
Right.
And hopefully give back in ways that make sure that everybody has the freedom to engage in those essential liberties.
Yeah. Before I forget, because I still have absent-minded professor syndrome, where does someone find out about this index?
Right. I should be on that too. Viewpointdiversityscore.org is our website. So
Viewpointdiversityscore.org.
That's right. You can go there. The index is there. There's 50 companies scored on the inaugural index. We focused on social media companies, tech companies, and financial services and banking service providers.
So name some names for us.
Yeah, sure.
You got 50
well, I mean, anybody else, if you name anybody, they're probably out there. So Bank of America, Meta, Alphabet, which is Google and YouTube.
The good guys.
Adobe, Airbnb, you'd be surprised maybe is on there. Paychecks. There's a lot of fintech services on there.
Which
Wells
makes
Fargo.
sense, unfortunately.
Yeah. So it's really some of the biggest names, household names in American business. And they are the ones that have the greatest potential to impact free speech and religious freedom from our perspective.
They really are. And it's sort of snuck up on us, right? So I mentioned the following to celebrate the great work of you and your colleagues with the index, not to promote heritage. But heritage has been blessed with a lot of generous donors. And we decided, given great fiscal stewardship of our permanent endowment, that we could sort of spend some of that interest that we've earned over the years and invest in the movement. That is to say, while Heritage works on every public policy issue, there are partners, especially like Alliance Defending Freedom, who occupy a lane that we will never occupy, which allows us to complement your work. And so we gave Alliance Defending Freedom recently $100,000 grant to scale this, to expand this work. And it's a real celebration of what you're doing. But tell us how the index will expand, not necessarily because of Heritage's gift. That's not why I'm asking the question. I'm asking the question from the standpoint of audience members who just want to know, in a year or two, is this list going to have more than 50 names on it?
Yeah. So, and we're very grateful for the gift, and it's such a great honor. Yeah, really appreciate it. We will actually grow the impact and scope of the index over the years. There will be additional companies added, 10 to 20 a year, most likely. But we're also going to increase the scope of the index as well from what we're studying. One of the things we're, I think, almost definitely going to add, whether that's a year 2 or year 3 thing, I haven't decided yet. We're still assessing, but is an international religious and free speech component.
Oh man, what a need.
Yeah. So there are, we keep getting told by folks who are looking at the index, there's an enormous need to judge them on how they are participating in a lot of evils internationally when it comes to these same issues. And that's, it's very obvious, and we know this. We tried to focus in on the domestic side in the inaugural index, but we definitely want to grow it into the international arena over the years. So we will continue to grow it. And, one of the things I'm excited about is that, we're also going to try to get some of our friends to take and participate in the index who we think will get really good scores too. Because one of the things we really want to show is that there are people who are doing it the right way. Yeah. And we have champions out there who can show the path to a lot of businesses who are probably looking around right now and saying, I really don't want to suffer the consequences that Disney is suffering,
Yeah.
or Netflix, or Twitter, because of their embracing of wokeism and of pushing so far left.
Yeah.
The pendulum is swinging back. And while the Fortune 1000, Fortune 500, they're movable probably on a lot of these issues. We'll see how movable. I think there's a broad swath of businesses out there who are looking at the experiences of some of these, blue chip companies right now over there. The kickback, they're getting over their embracing of wokeism, and they're thinking there's got to be a better path.
Yeah.
And I really think this index shows that it's about broadly respecting the diverse views represented within your workforce, your customer base, the broader public square. Why wouldn't you want to be known for that? It's not about driving these companies to be conservative companies or religious companies or take positions on issues that we want them to take.
Yep.
We just want them to respect these freedoms and do things that give back to the community in a way that affirms those and supports them.
I'm glad you clarified that, because I knew that about the index, but I think a lot of times as Americans, especially if they're center left, even center right, they hear these efforts like the index you're working on, some of the work that Heritage does in education, and they think, oh, these are guys just trying to make everything conservative. Decidedly not the case. If that happens, that's fantastic, right?
Right.
But all we want is for them to be neutral. I mean, I think about my friend Peter Rex, who's also a recent guest on the show, and Peter himself is conservative Christian. He doesn't require that of his many employees. All he requires of them is to do business in a way that's objective and neutral, and at least as it pertains to their lives professionally, to come to work and work rather than to use their work as a cudgel against those of us who are conservative.
Yes, absolutely. And, I think what a lot of the businesses are doing by embracing this identity-based understanding of diversity is they're bringing a lot of toxicity into their workplaces. They're setting up these, zones and these groups inside their organizations that become activists that push them in all these different directions. And the reality is, they need to adopt an understanding of diversity that's based on a diversity of viewpoint and perspective,
right? Not
on skin color and all these other factors that the left really drives when they're talking about diversity. Those things really are a path to a very destructive and toxic workforce, for instance. And we've heard these stories from people we've talked to who are, unfortunately inside of corporations that have full scale adopted these practices, and they're saying, it is just driving wedges between people inside the workforce. And you even saw it with Disney when they engaged on the parental rights bill down in Florida, and they had a pretty large group of anonymous Disney employees, conservative religious Disney employees, write an open letter saying, it is very toxic to work at Disney. It's an unfriendly place, and we're afraid to be outed, and we'll lose our job. I don't think any business ultimately will survive if that's the kind of workforce they're cultivating. And if they follow our index, they'll have a workforce that's good for everybody, that's accepting of all views.
That's right. And then perhaps, just perhaps, we could get back to a situation in the United States where our civil discourse is actually civil.
Yes.
But you and I both know as conservatives, dating back to when we were in high school and college, that's been difficult.
Yes.
Yeah. Speaking of that, as we sit here recording this in Washington, D.C., but 3 or 4 blocks from the Supreme Court, having you seated here inspires me to ask you what you think is going to happen with the Roe decision, the Dobbs decision.
Sure. Well, we're certainly hopeful based on the released opinion that it will result in an overturning of Roe. We ultimately can't know what the outcome is. That opinion was dated sometime in February, and there are a lot of discussions and things that go on inside the closed doors of the Supreme Court. So, we certainly are very hopeful that Roe will be reversed and that issue will be returned to the states. And right now, we're just prayerfully, holding that up to the Lord and asking for that outcome. And that's where we're at. So, we're prepared for a reversal. And, we certainly understand that once the reversal occurs, that is just the beginning of the work in the states. Yeah. And, we even see right now that work is already undergoing, and being undergone in the states with laws being passed to try to restrict abortion laws being passed, trying to legalize abortion, and there will be court cases after if Roe gets reversed. So, we are prepping for the 50 state, battle that comes next.
Yeah.
But we're excited about that.
Yeah, we are too. And I guess I'm not mistaken if I were to say that 50 state battle, presuming the decision goes the way we think, is going to take many years.
I think that's right.
Yep.
I think that's right. But if Roe is reversed, we get rid of one enormous impediment to our ability to advocate for life. And so, it'd be certainly grateful beyond all measure if that's the outcome we get.
Yeah. Let's look into your crystal ball with a couple of final questions. One of them, you have a case coming up, I think this fall. You will correct me if I'm mistaken, I know. The 303 creative case. I know that you and your colleagues are very excited about that. Tell us about it.
That's right. So 303 creative involves a web designer in Colorado, same state as Jack Phillips.
Something about Colorado.
Yes. Man. Yes. Well, we sued on this maybe 7 or so years ago, a separate case from Jack Phillips' case, but challenging the same law that was used to punish Jack Phillips. And Lori Smith is a web designer who wants to create websites celebrating marriages. Lots of engaged couples like to have these websites designed for them now as a hub for all the people attending to kind of get excited about the wedding and plan everything, communicate messages about the upcoming wedding. And so Lori wants to get into that business, but she can't because of Colorado's law. Because if she gets into that business, creates websites for weddings that she wants to celebrate between one man and one woman, consistent with her religious convictions, Colorado's law and their interpretation of their law means that she also has to create websites for weddings that she disagrees with, that violate her convictions, weddings celebrating same-sex marriages. And so rather than suffer the consequences, go in and start that business and start doing those websites, get the request, and then you have this lawsuit come at her like Jack Phillips had. She filed a preemptive lawsuit asking the court to enjoin the enforcement of that law in a way that would force her to violate her religious beliefs and create those websites promoting ideas of marriage that she disagrees with. And so that's been in the courts for 6-7 years. The Supreme Court finally accepted cert in that case earlier this year. We actually filed our opening brief about a week and a half ago in that case, and we likely will argue it at the end of November. It's a really important case. I mean, it deals with the issue that was left open in Masterpiece Cake Shop, the free speech issue, whether the government can coerce private business owners who are engaged in expression to promote ideas they disagree with. And, one thing I think people really need to understand about this case is it is a case that deals with everybody's free speech rights. Because if the government has this power over one person, it has it over everyone. So if Lori Smith can be compelled to create websites she disagrees with, then, the atheist web designer can be forced to create websites for churches or to promote the idea that God exists. And this is not that's not a free society. In a free society, we respect the fact that people have these differences of opinion, and we certainly don't use the force of government to compel them to express ideas they disagree with. So these are really fundamental liberties that are under attack because a lot of what we've been talking about, the woke agenda, the sexual orientation, gender identity, non-discrimination laws, these are all the tools that are being used to coerce conformity and silence dissent. And so it's really important that this case is up at the Supreme Court. We're excited about being able to argue it. Our general counsel, Kristen Wagner, will be arguing it probably in the fall.
Good. So argued in the fall, and when would we expect a decision?
Well, it's that crystal ball thing. No later than June of 2023.
Yeah, I knew that would be the answer. But it can't be more specific than that,
That's
right? Yeah, that's the nature of the beast.
That's right.
Last question, and I'll be abusive and make it two parts. The first is, are you optimistic about Americans being able to regain some of the religious freedoms we've lost? And secondly, what can individual average Americans, most of them not attorneys, do to help effect that change?
Sure. Yeah, I am hopeful about it. And the reason I am, in part, is because as I've observed what's going on culturally, there's probably a period of time where we felt like we were losing every battle.
Definitely.
And the pendulum just kept feeling like it was swinging further and further to the left.
Like the pendulum was going to crush us against that brick wall behind you.
Right. But as we know, as students of history, and just experiencing what we are right now, these pendulums often swing back.
That's right.
And I feel like we're at that moment. I feel like it has gone as far, maybe not in every context as it will, but people are aware now of what's going on. Mm-hmm. It's no longer subterfuge. It's no longer obfuscated. It's very clear what's going on.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people don't like the direction that they're seeing and the path, the ultimate destination of this woke agenda. And so things are getting pulled back, and I think the ground is very fertile. And I think that it's incumbent upon us as, conservative and religious people to make the case for why what we believe in and why the things that we believe lead to a flourishing and healthy society are good. Cast a positive vision for the world as we understand it, and why it's good, not just for us, but for everyone, institutions, individuals. And, so I'm very encouraged. And I think there's a great deal there's reason to be very hopeful that we'll be starting to gain ground here soon.
Good. Jeremy Tedesco of the Alliance Defending Freedom, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me on.
And thanks for everything that you and your colleagues do.
And you guys as well at Heritage. Thank you.
You bet. Well, thanks again for joining the Kevin Roberts Show. I will put in a plug and say, if you're enjoying the guests, please give us a 5-star rating. We will be back next time with another great American patriot who is leading the way to reclaim ground that we've lost. Take care.